The night shift at Harbor Point Tower had been posted for over 2 weeks. 23 people had looked at it. 23 people had walked away. Ethan Miller didn't. He stood in the small temp agency office with the paper in his hands, the fluorescent lights buzzing overhead, reading the details like they might change if he looked long enough. Overnight security, 12 hours, downtown Chicago, time and a half pay, high turnover, no explanations given. He already knew why no one wanted it. That morning, before the sun came up, his daughter Emily had sat at the kitchen table in mismatched socks, pushing cereal around her bowl. She hadn't been complaining, she rarely did, but she looked up at him with those observant, too wise eyes and asked quietly, "Dad, why do you always take the hardest jobs?" Ethan had smiled, the practiced, reassuring kind. "Because they pay better," he said. It wasn't the whole truth, not even close. The truth was heavier, more complicated. It lived in unpaid medical bills, in a photo of his late wife still taped to the fridge, in the constant low-grade anxiety of raising a 7-year-old alone in a city that never slowed down for people like him. By 11:15 p.m., Ethan was standing in the lobby of Harbor Point Tower, a 70-story wall of glass and steel cutting into the Chicago night. During the day, it was all polished marble and confident footsteps. At night, it felt cavernous, hollow, too quiet. The security desk was empty. A cold cup of coffee sat untouched beside a logbook filled with neat handwriting that gradually thinned out over the past few weeks. Fewer notes, shorter entries, like people had stopped caring. Ethan clipped the radio to his belt, tested his flashlight, and signed his name at the bottom of the page. Outside, the city hummed, sirens in the distance, the rumble of the L, the steady pulse of life going on without him. Inside the building, it was just Ethan and the echo of his own footsteps. He took his first steps down the long corridor, shoulders slightly tense, senses alert. He wasn't afraid, but he was cautious, weathered, responsible, quietly determined. This wasn't just another shift. Ethan didn't know it yet, but by the time the sun rose over Lake Michigan, this building and his life would never feel the same again. The deeper Ethan walked into Harbor Point Tower, the more the silence changed. It wasn't empty. Not really. The building breathed, low, mechanical, constant. Air handlers whispered behind walls. Elevators chimed on floors no one stood on, as if responding to calls made in dreams. Every sound felt amplified, stretched thin in the absence of people. Ethan moved methodically, the way years of night work had taught him to. Checkpoints, fire exits, locked doors. His boots echoed against polished floors that had been designed for confident daytime traffic. Not a single man walking alone after midnight. The lobby had felt impressive. The upper floors felt impersonal, utilitarian. Rows of offices sat dark and untouched, chairs pushed in neatly, coffee mugs abandoned on desks like someone might come back any second. He passed framed motivational posters, innovation, integrity, vision, their words floating uselessly in the dark. Around 1 a.m., he reached a window overlooking the city. Chicago stretched out below him, restless and alive. Headlights streamed down the streets. Somewhere out there, Emily was asleep on the couch at Mrs. Alvarez's place, her stuffed rabbit tucked under her arm, trusting her dad to come home in the morning like he always did. That thought grounded him. Ethan rolled his shoulders, releasing a bit of tension he hadn't realized he was carrying. He wasn't scared, but he was alert, seasoned, watchful. Buildings like this didn't intimidate him, but they demanded respect. Too much money, too many shortcuts, too many people assuming someone else was paying attention. As he continued his rounds, Ethan noticed small things. A door that stuck slightly when it shouldn't. A maintenance tag curling at the edges, dated months back. Corners where dust had settled undisturbed, thick enough to suggest neglect rather than coincidence. Nothing dangerous, not yet. Still, a quiet unease followed him down the hallway, subtle but persistent. Like the sense you get when a room feels too still, too controlled, when order exists not because it's maintained, but because no one has looked closely in a long time. Ethan kept walking. He didn't know what he was looking for, only that something, somewhere in this building, was waiting to be noticed. Ethan's phone buzzed at 12:07 a.m. The vibration was soft but sharp in the stillness, enough to make him stop mid-step near a stairwell door. He glanced around out of habit, empty corridor, dim lights, then pulled the phone from his pocket. A photo came through first. Emily was asleep on Mrs. Alvarez's couch, curled on her side, her math workbook spread open and forgotten on the coffee table. Her stuffed rabbit was tucked under her arm, one ear folded the way she liked it. The sight tightened something in Ethan's chest. Then the voice message. "Hi, Daddy. Mrs. Alvarez said I could stay up until you texted goodnight, but I got too sleepy." There was a pause, the soft rustle of fabric. "I hope your new job isn't too scary. I know you're working really hard for us." Another pause. "I love you. See you in the morning." Ethan leaned back against the cool concrete wall and closed his eyes. The building didn't feel as heavy after that. He saved the message and listened again. Lower this time, letting the sound of her voice settle him. Steady, anchoring, familiar. The kind of reminder that didn't just warm you, it straightened you. He pushed off the wall and headed back into the corridor. The hum of the building returned, but it no longer pressed in on him. He walked with more purpose now, flashlight steady, posture squared. This wasn't just a paycheck. It was groceries, rent, school supplies. It was making sure Emily never had to wonder if her dad would come home. As Ethan continued his rounds, checking locks, testing doors, marking times, he carried that small voice with him, like a quiet light cutting through the dark. Every step felt more deliberate. Every detail mattered more. He didn't know what the rest of the night would bring. But whatever happened, he knew one thing for sure. He wasn't walking these halls alone anymore. By the time Ethan reached the upper mechanical floors, the building felt different. Less polished, more exposed. The walls were unfinished here, painted a dull industrial gray. Pipes ran openly along the ceiling. The air smelled faintly of metal and recycled heat. This wasn't a space designed to impress anyone. It was where the building showed its bones. Ethan stepped into a fire control room on the 58th floor and did what he'd done 100 times before in other buildings. He scanned the panels, checked indicator lights, let his eyes settle on the gauges. That's when he froze. The main pressure dial sat well below where it should have been. Ethan leaned in, frowning, flashlight beam steady on the glass. He tapped the gauge lightly with a knuckle. The needle didn't move. He checked the secondary readout. Same result. Too low. Not slightly off, so not within tolerance, dangerously low. A knot formed in his stomach as training and instinct collided. Low pressure meant sprinklers that might activate, but wouldn't deliver enough water. It meant fire alarms screaming while flames kept climbing. It meant panic, smoke, and exits filling too fast. He looked for the maintenance log bolted to the wall. Every entry was neat, confident, initialed, all systems normal. Ethan flipped back through months of records. Nothing flagged, nothing questioned. Just routine sign-offs over and over, like someone had been checking boxes instead of checking reality. He stepped back, heart beating harder now. 5,000 people worked in this building during the day. Office staff, maintenance crews, executives, people who trusted that the systems protecting them actually worked. They had no idea. Ethan stared at the gauge again, feeling the weight of it settle into his chest. Uneasy, focused, alert. This wasn't a broken light or a stuck door. This was the kind of problem that got people hurt. And suddenly the reason no one wanted this shift made terrifying sense. Ethan reached for his radio first. "Security to building management," he said, keeping his voice calm. "I'm on the 58th floor. I'm seeing low pressure on the fire suppression system. Can you confirm?" Static answered him, a hiss of dead air. He tried again, nothing. So he pulled the emergency contact list from the wall and dialed the after-hours number. It rang and rang. 12 times before dumping him into a voicemail that sounded like it hadn't been checked in weeks. His jaw tightened. Finally, a number in the security binder connected. A woman answered, her voice thick with sleep and irritation. "This is Ethan Miller, overnight security," he said. "I've got a serious issue up here. Fire suppression pressure is well below safe range. This needs immediate attention." He paused, then a sigh. "That system was inspected last month," she said. "It's fine." "I'm looking at the gauges right now," Ethan replied, forcing his tone to stay respectful. "They're reading nearly 40% under normal. If there's a fire—" "You're new, right?" she cut in. The words landed heavier than they should have. "Look," she continued, her voice sharpening, "the night shift is simple. You do your rounds, You sign the logs, you go home. Don't make problems where there aren't any. It just creates headaches for everyone, including you. The line went dead. Ethan stood there, phone still in his hand, surrounded by humming machinery and the quiet weight of the building. Dismissed, minimized, conveniently ignored. He thought of the neat signatures in the maintenance log, of the pressure gauge that refused to lie, of Emily's voice, soft and trusting, telling him she loved him. This wasn't confusion. It wasn't a mistake. It was a system that counted on people like him to stay quiet. Ethan slowly lowered the phone. For a long moment, he did nothing at all. Just listened to the steady hum of equipment and felt a familiar pressure building in his chest. He could walk away, sign the log, finish his shift. Or he could do something that would almost certainly cost him the job he couldn't afford to lose. And for the first time that night, Ethan realized this wasn't just a bad shift. It was a test. Ethan left the mechanical room and continued his rounds, but his body moved on instinct alone. His mind stayed behind with that pressure gauge, with the woman's voice telling him to stop asking questions. Don't make problems where there aren't any. He'd heard versions of that line before, at warehouses, job sites, security desks. It was the unspoken rule for people at the bottom. Keep your head down, be grateful, don't notice things that make powerful people uncomfortable. The hallway felt narrower now, the lights harsher, every step echoed louder than before. Ethan stopped by a window overlooking the city. Chicago glowed beneath him, restless and alive. Somewhere out there, Emily was sleeping, trusting that her dad would always do what he said he would do. He pulled out his phone again and played her message. I know you're working really hard for us. The words hit differently this time. Steady, honest, unfiltered. She didn't know about pressure gauges or liability or corporate shortcuts, but she knew what it meant to try, to care, to do the right thing even when it was hard. Ethan rested his forehead briefly against the glass. If something happened in this building, if people got hurt, and he'd known and done nothing, that was a weight he wouldn't be able to set down. Not ever. Not when Emily was older and asked him about it. Not when he looked at himself in the mirror. The job mattered, the paycheck mattered. But some things mattered more. Ethan straightened, his shoulders settling into a quiet resolve. Clear-eyed, grounded, determined. He knew exactly what this would cost him, and he knew he was going to do it anyway. He turned away from the window and headed back toward the upper floors, not to finish his rounds, but to start doing something that was never in his job description. No one was watching. That was the point. Ethan moved fast, but not sloppy. He returned to the mechanical floors with a focus that cut through the fatigue. He photographed the pressure gauges from multiple angles, making sure the numbers were clear, the timestamps visible. He recorded short videos, narrating quietly as he went, stating the floor, the room, the readings. Methodical, precise, controlled. This wasn't anger driving him now, it was clarity. In another utility room, he found the same problem. Then another. Floor after floor, the pattern repeated. What he'd hoped was an isolated issue wasn't isolated at all. Everything above the 50th floor shared the same compromised system. His stomach sank. That included the executive levels, corner offices, boardrooms, people in tailored suits who trusted reports and certifications without ever setting foot in these rooms. Ethan accessed a maintenance terminal using a generic login taped to the monitor. An oversight so careless it almost felt insulting. The service records loaded slowly. When they did, his worst suspicion was confirmed. Deferred repairs, skipped inspections, digital check marks replacing real work. Someone hadn't just missed this. Someone had decided it was easier not to fix. The clock on his phone read 4:02 a.m. Ethan kept going. He copied logs, took screenshots, cross-referenced dates. His handwriting stayed neat as he filled page after page in his notebook, documenting everything as if he were building a case for someone who didn't know him and wouldn't care about excuses. By the time he finished, his legs ached and his eyes burned, but his hands were steady. This wasn't about getting anyone in trouble. It was about making sure no one could say they didn't know. Ethan stood alone in the quiet hum of machinery, evidence secured, heart pounding, not from fear, but from the weight of what came next. He checked the time again, 4:29 a.m. He had one more decision to make, and once he made it, there would be no walking it back. Ethan stood in front of the fire control panel longer than he needed to. The switch was clearly labeled, Level 2 Safety Notification. Not an evacuation, not a panic alarm. Just enough to force attention. Just enough to create a record that couldn't be buried at the bottom of a forgotten inbox. He knew what it would do. An official incident report, automatic forwarding, city oversight, questions that couldn't be answered with polite excuses or half-checked boxes. Ethan exhaled slowly and flipped the switch. The system responded with a soft chime, almost disappointingly quiet for a decision that felt so loud inside his chest. He logged the action under his own name, his own badge number. No shortcuts, no anonymity. Then he sat at the security desk and wrote. He documented everything. Locations, pressure readings, falsified maintenance logs, timestamps. He attached photos, videos, notes. He sent the report to every emergency contact listed in the building's database. Careful not to exaggerate, careful not to editorialize. Just facts. When he was done, the sun was beginning to lighten the edges of the sky. Ethan leaned back in the chair and pulled out his phone. He played Emily's message again, letting her sleepy voice fill the small security office. I love you. See you in the morning. His throat tightened. Whatever happened next, being fired, blacklisted, ignored, he could live with it. He'd crossed the line that mattered, honest, uncompromising, at peace. At 7 a.m., Ethan signed out, clipped his jacket closed, and walked out of Harbor Point Tower as the city woke up around him. No one stopped him. No one thanked him. And that was okay. Some choices aren't made for applause. They're made so you can sleep at night and wake up able to look your child in the eye. Claire Whitman started her mornings early. By 6:45 a.m., she was already in her corner office on the 67th floor. Lake Michigan stretching out beyond the glass like a sheet of cold steel. Being early wasn't a power move, it was habit, discipline, the kind that had turned a small real estate firm into a billion-dollar portfolio before she turned 35. She was halfway through her first briefing when the incident report hit her inbox. At first, she skimmed it, assuming it was another routine notification, a minor alert, a drill logged incorrectly, something her team would clean up before her second cup of coffee. Then she slowed down. Photos of pressure gauges, video clips, timestamps, a calm, detailed explanation written in plain language. No exaggeration, no panic. Claire felt a chill settle in her chest. The report confirmed a systemic failure in the fire suppression system covering the upper floors of Harbor Point Tower, including her own office. The issue had gone unaddressed for months. Worse, the maintenance logs showed repeated sign-offs declaring everything within normal range. Someone had lied. She pulled up the sender's profile. Ethan Miller, overnight security, temporary contract, no executive access, no incentive to look this closely. Claire sat back in her chair, suddenly very aware of the height beneath her feet. Her phone rang. Facilities management, already nervous, already defensive. She cut them off mid-sentence. Don't explain yet, she said evenly. Investigate. Pull every maintenance record from the past year. I want names, I want signatures, I want answers. When the call ended, Claire stared at the skyline, her reflection faint in the glass. A system she'd trusted had failed. And the person who'd caught it wasn't an expert or an executive or a consultant. It was a man on the night shift. A man who had nothing to gain and everything to lose. Claire reached for her coat. She needed to meet him. The address led Claire to a 3-story brick walk-up on the northwest side of the city. It wasn't dangerous, it wasn't dramatic. It was just tired, faded brick. A front door that didn't quite close right, the kind of building you passed every day without really seeing because it blended into the background of a city full of people getting by. Claire sat in the car for a moment longer than she meant to. This wasn't a boardroom. There were no assistants, no prepared talking points, no polished agenda. Just a name, a decision, and the quiet weight of responsibility. She stepped out. Inside, the hallway smelled faintly of cooking oil and old carpet. A single fluorescent light buzzed overhead. Claire climbed the stairs, her heels sounding too sharp, too expensive for the space, and stopped in front of apartment 3B. She knocked. The door opened to a small girl in pajama pants and a sweatshirt 2 sizes too big. Brown hair pulled into a messy ponytail. Alert eyes. Yes, the girl asked, studying Claire without hesitation. I'm looking for Ethan Miller, Claire said gently. That's my dad, the girl replied. Then more firmly, he didn't do anything wrong. The words landed like a quiet challenge. Before Claire could respond, Ethan appeared behind her, one hand settling protectively on his daughter's shoulder. He looked exhausted. Deep, honest exhaustion. But his eyes were sharp, assessing. "Emily," he said softly, "go finish your breakfast." She hesitated, then nodded, glancing once more at Claire before disappearing inside. Ethan stepped forward, not blocking the doorway, but not inviting her in either. "You're from the building," he said. "Yes," Claire replied, "I own it." A flicker crossed his face. Not fear, calculation. "Then you know why I did what I did," he said. "I do," Claire answered, "but I needed to hear it from you." Ethan met her gaze, steady and unflinching. "Because people work there," he said, "and because my daughter believes I do the right thing, even when it's hard." For the first time in a long while, Claire Whitman didn't have a response ready, and somehow that felt exactly right. Claire didn't rush to fill the silence. She'd spent years in rooms where people talked too much, explained too much, tried to justify things that felt wrong the moment they were said. This wasn't one of those moments. This one deserved space. "My team confirmed everything you reported," she said finally. "The fire suppression system has been compromised for months. Records were falsified, repairs delayed. If you hadn't acted, we might not have caught it until it was too late." Ethan listened without interruption, arms loosely crossed, expression guarded but calm, measured, grounded, wary. He'd learned the hard way not to trust promises that sounded too good. "So what happens now?" he asked. "That depends on you." Claire reached into her coat and pulled out a business card. Simple, heavy stock, her name embossed in clean lettering. She held it out, but didn't push it into his hand. "I'm offering you a permanent position," she said. "Not security, a role on our corporate safety team. You'd report directly to me." Ethan's brow furrowed slightly. "The salary is $160,000, Claire continued. "Full benefits, health coverage for you and your daughter, a schedule that doesn't force you to choose between work and being her dad." Ethan glanced back toward the apartment, where the faint sound of a cartoon played from the living room. "Why?" he asked. "You don't know me." "I know enough," Claire replied. "You saw something wrong and acted when staying quiet would have been easier. You signed your name knowing it could cost you everything." She paused. "I can't teach that. I can only recognize it." Ethan didn't take the card. "I need time," he said. "My daughter has a school presentation next week. She asked me to be there." Claire nodded without hesitation. "You'll have the day off," she said. "Take all the time you need. The offer stands." She placed the card gently on the small table by the door and stepped back. For the first time since she'd knocked, something in Ethan's posture softened. Not relief, something closer to hope. 3 weeks later, Ethan Miller sat in a glass-walled conference room on the 40th floor of Harbor Point Tower. Morning light spilled across the table. Reports were stacked neatly in front of him. Real reports this time. Honest ones. The kind that didn't hide behind check marks or comfortable assumptions. Outside the window, the city moved the way it always had, unaware of how close it had come to something worse. Ethan adjusted the chair slightly. He still wasn't used to the quiet confidence of rooms like this, but he belonged here now, not because of a title, but because of what he'd done when no one was watching. Earlier that week, he'd stood in the back of Emily's classroom, coffee in hand, watching her present her science project with nervous pride. She'd scanned the room, found him, and smiled. Not a big smile, just a relieved one. He'd made it. That mattered more than the salary, more than the office, more than the view. Claire Whitman kept her word. Repairs were completed in 72 hours. Managers who'd signed off on false reports were quietly removed. A new safety reporting system was put in place, one that listened to people on the ground, not just those at the top. And Claire herself changed too. She walked buildings now, asked questions, learned names, paid attention to the details she used to overlook, because one man had refused to look away. That evening, Ethan sat on the couch in their new apartment, clean, warm, secure, while Emily worked on her homework beside him. "Dad," she asked suddenly. "Yeah? Did you fix the broken thing in the tall building?" Ethan smiled, thinking carefully before answering. "I helped," he said. "But the important part is, I noticed it." Emily nodded like this made perfect sense. "Noticing is important," she said. "That's how you stop bad things before they happen." Ethan wrapped an arm around her, feeling the quiet truth in her words settle deep in his chest. Proud, steady, fulfilled. Later that night, after Emily fell asleep, Ethan stood by the window and looked out at the city. Somewhere out there were thousands of people who would never know his name, who would never know how close they'd come to danger. And that was okay, because integrity isn't about being seen. It's about choosing what kind of person you are when the choice costs you something. So here's the question for you. If you were in Ethan's place, tired, underpaid, invisible, would you have spoken up? Would you risk everything to do the right thing, even if no one promised a reward? And what kind of legacy are you leaving behind in the quiet choices you make every day? If this story moved you, if it made you pause, reflect, or see the world a little differently, consider subscribing to the channel. Because these stories aren't about heroes with capes. They're about ordinary people who notice, who care, who choose integrity when silence would be easier. Subscribe, stay with us, and don't miss the next story, because sometimes the quietest choices change everything.